I was ignored when I defended my friend, but what happened next left everyone speechless. I still remember that day like it was yesterday, the day I learned that standing up for someone you care about can change everything, even when you have nothing to offer but your voice and your tears. Before we continue, if stories like this inspire you, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss the next ones. My name is Marcus, and I was 10 years old when this happened. 10 years old, wearing the same faded jeans I'd worn all week, sitting in a classroom in a small town in Ohio where everyone knew everyone's business, where everyone knew my mom worked 2 jobs just to keep our lights on, where everyone knew we bought our clothes from the donation bin at church, where everyone knew I brought the same peanut butter sandwich to school every single day, because that's all we could afford. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead that morning, casting that harsh white glow that made everything look washed out and tired. Mrs. Henderson was writing something on the chalkboard, her back turned to us, and the classroom smelled like old textbooks and the cleaning solution the janitor used every night. I sat in the 3rd row, right next to the window, where I could sometimes escape by watching the clouds drift by when things got too hard to handle inside those 4 walls. Next to me sat Daniel. Daniel was my best friend, the only kid in that entire school who never once made me feel small for being poor. His family wasn't rich either, but they had a little more than we did. His dad worked at the factory on the edge of town, steady work that paid the bills and then some. Daniel always had new notebooks at the start of the school year. He always had snacks in his backpack that he'd share with me without making it seem like charity. He never asked why I wore the same rotation of 3 shirts. He just treated me like I mattered. That morning, Daniel was quieter than usual. I noticed it right away because Daniel was the kind of kid who always had something to say, always had a joke ready, always knew how to make the bad days feel a little lighter. But that day, he sat hunched over his desk, his shoulders tight, his eyes fixed on the wood grain pattern like he was trying to memorize every swirl and line. I leaned over and whispered, asking him what was wrong. He just shook his head, barely moving it, like even that small motion took too much energy. I didn't push. When you grow up with nothing, you learn to recognize when someone's carrying a weight they're not ready to share. You learn to give people space even when you desperately want to help. The morning dragged on. Math worksheets. Reading time. Mrs. Henderson's voice droning on about multiplication tables and vocabulary words. And then came lunch. The cafeteria was loud that day, louder than usual. Metal trays clanging. Kids shouting across tables. The lunch ladies calling out numbers for the free and reduced lunch program, which was how most of us ate. I grabbed my tray and headed to our usual spot, a table near the back wall where the paint was peeling and someone had carved their initials into the surface years ago. Daniel got his tray and sat down across from me. He still wasn't talking much. He picked at his food, moving it around with his plastic fork but not really eating anything. I watched him for a minute, trying to figure out how to help, when I heard it. Laughter. Loud, mean laughter coming from 2 tables over. I looked up and saw Brandon Cooper and his group. Brandon was one of those kids who seemed to have everything. New clothes every month, the latest sneakers, a backpack covered in patches from places he'd been on vacation. His dad owned a car dealership in the next town over, and Brandon never let anyone forget it. He had this way of looking at the rest of us like we were beneath him, like our existence was just background noise in his perfect life. Brandon was pointing at Daniel, his face twisted in that cruel smile that kids like him perfect early on. His friends were laughing too, following his lead like they always did. And Brandon was saying something, his voice carrying across the cafeteria even through all the noise. He was talking about Daniel's shoes. I looked down at Daniel's feet under the table. His shoes were worn, the soles separating slightly from the fabric, the laces frayed at the ends. They were old shoes, shoes that had seen too many miles, shoes that should have been replaced months ago. But I knew Daniel's family was struggling. I'd overheard my mom talking to his mom at church a few weeks back. Something about his dad's hours getting cut at the factory, about them falling behind on bills. Brandon kept going. He stood up now, making sure everyone could see him, making sure this moment would be witnessed by as many people as possible. He called Daniel poor. He called him trash. He said Daniel's shoes looked like they'd been fished out of a dumpster. He said Daniel probably smelled like one too. The cafeteria got quieter, not silent but quiet enough that everyone knew something was happening. Quiet enough that kids at other tables turned to watch. quiet enough that even the lunch ladies looked over to see what was going on. Daniel's face went red, not the red of anger, but the red of shame, of humiliation so deep it makes your whole body burn. His eyes filled with tears that he was desperately trying to hold back, and his hands gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. I felt something surge through me in that moment, something hot and fierce and completely overwhelming. It wasn't just anger at Brandon, though that was part of it. It was something bigger. It was the recognition of my own pain in Daniel's face. Every time someone had made fun of my clothes. Every time I'd pretended not to hear the whispers about my family. Every time I'd gone home hungry because I was too embarrassed to ask for seconds in the lunch line. All of it came rushing back at once, and I couldn't just sit there and watch my only friend go through the same thing. I stood up. My legs felt shaky like they might give out at any second, but I stood up anyway. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were trembling. But I stood up and I walked over to Brandon's table. The cafeteria got even quieter. Brandon looked at me with this mixture of surprise and amusement, like he couldn't believe someone like me would dare approach him. His friends stopped laughing, waiting to see what would happen next. Everyone was watching now. Even the lunch ladies had stopped serving food. I opened my mouth to speak and my voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. But it came out. I told Brandon to leave Daniel alone. I told him that making fun of someone's shoes was pathetic. I told him that having money didn't make him better than anyone else. Brandon's face changed. The amusement vanished, replaced by something colder, something mean. He stepped closer to me, towering over me even though he was only a year older. He asked me what I was going to do about it. He said I should look in the mirror before defending someone else because I looked just as pathetic as Daniel. He said we were both losers, both poor, both worthless. And then he did something I didn't expect. He grabbed my shirt right at the collar and pulled. The fabric tore, not completely, but enough that everyone could see, enough that the sound of ripping cloth echoed through that quiet cafeteria, enough that I felt the cool air on my skin where my shirt had been intact just seconds before. I should have been embarrassed. I should have felt the same shame that Daniel felt. But instead I felt something else entirely. I felt clear, crystal clear about what I needed to do. I looked Brandon right in the eyes and I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, that he could make fun of my clothes all he wanted. He could tear my shirt. He could call me poor. He could say whatever he needed to say to make himself feel big. But Daniel was my friend. Daniel was a good person. And nothing Brandon said would change that. My voice cracked when I said it. And then something happened that I hadn't planned. Something I couldn't control even if I'd wanted to. Tears started rolling down my face. Not quiet tears that I could hide. Real tears. Hot and fast and unstoppable. Tears for Daniel. Tears for myself. Tears for every kid in that cafeteria who'd ever been made to feel less than human because they didn't have enough money. I wasn't trying to cry. I wasn't doing it for effect. It just happened. The emotion of the moment, the fear, the anger, the love for my friend, all of it came pouring out at once, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Brandon stepped back, and for just a second I saw something flicker across his face. Confusion, maybe, or discomfort, like he hadn't expected this response and didn't know what to do with it. But then Daniel was there, standing next to me, and Daniel was crying too, not because Brandon had made fun of him, but because I was crying, because I'd stood up for him. Because in that moment he realized he wasn't alone. We stood there together, two poor kids in a cafeteria full of people who had more than us, crying in front of everyone. It should have been humiliating. It should have been the worst moment of our lives, but somehow it wasn't. Somehow, standing there with Daniel, both of us vulnerable and exposed and completely honest about how much it hurt to be treated like we didn't matter, somehow that felt like the bravest thing I'd ever done. The cafeteria stayed quiet for what felt like forever but was probably only a few seconds. And then something unexpected happened. Someone else stood up, a girl named Sarah from our grade, who usually kept to herself. She walked over to us and stood next to Daniel, not saying anything, just standing there. And then another kid stood up, and another. Within a minute, there were maybe 10 kids standing with us, creating this silent wall of support that said more than words ever could. Mrs. Patterson, the cafeteria monitor, finally broke through the crowd. She took one look at the situation, at Brandon still standing there with his cruel smile fading, at me with my torn shirt and tear-streaked face, at Daniel crying next to me, and at all the other kids who'd come to stand with us. She told Brandon to go to the principal's office. She told him to go right now. Brandon tried to argue, tried to say he was just joking around, tried to make it seem like we were overreacting. But Mrs. Patterson wasn't having it. She pointed toward the door and told him again to go. This time he went, his friends trailing behind him like they always did. After he left, Mrs. Patterson knelt down in front of me and Daniel. She had this gentle look on her face, the kind of look that makes you feel safe even when everything else is falling apart. She asked if we were okay. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure it was true. Daniel nodded too. She stood up and addressed the entire cafeteria. She said that what had just happened was unacceptable. She said that bullying wouldn't be tolerated in this school. She said that every single student deserved respect, regardless of what they wore or where they came from. And then she said something that stuck with me for years afterward. She said that real strength isn't about having the most or being the loudest. Real strength is about standing up for what's right even when it's hard. Real strength is about showing up for the people you care about even when it costs you something. She looked right at me when she said that last part, and I felt my tears start up again. But this time they felt different. Less like tears of pain and more like tears of relief. Like something inside me had been validated, had been seen and acknowledged as worthy. The lunch period ended shortly after that. We all went back to class, but something had shifted. Kids I'd never talked to before came up to me in the hallway and said they thought what I did was brave. Teachers looked at me differently, with more warmth, like they were seeing me as a whole person for the first time instead of just another poor kid taking up space in their classroom. Daniel and I walked home together that afternoon like we always did. We didn't talk much at first. We just walked, our backpacks heavy on our shoulders, our feet following the familiar route through our neighborhood. Eventually, Daniel broke the silence. He said thank you. He said he'd never forget what I did. He said he didn't know what he would have done if I hadn't stood up for him. I told him he didn't need to thank me. I told him that's what friends do. They show up, they stand together, they cry together if that's what it takes. But nobody imagined that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. If this story has already moved you so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel, because there are other real and emotional stories you can't miss. The next morning, I woke up expecting everything to go back to normal. That's how life worked in my experience. Something happens, people talk about it for a day, and then everyone moves on. But when I got to school, I realized this wasn't going to be one of those times. Kids were looking at me differently, not with pity, which I'd gotten used to over the years. This was something else, something I couldn't quite name at first. Respect maybe, recognition, like I'd crossed some invisible line and suddenly existed in a way I hadn't before. Daniel met me at the entrance like always. His eyes were still a little red from yesterday, but he was smiling. A real smile, not the forced kind he'd been wearing lately. He told me his mom had heard about what happened. The school had called her, explained the situation, told her about Brandon getting suspended for 3 days. She'd cried when she heard the full story. She'd asked Daniel to tell me thank you, to tell me their family wouldn't forget what I did. I felt uncomfortable hearing that. I didn't do it for recognition or gratitude. I did it because Daniel was my friend and he was hurting and I couldn't just sit there and watch. But Daniel's mom was a good woman, someone who'd given me food when my mom was between paychecks, someone who'd mended my jacket when it tore without making me feel like a charity case. So I just nodded and told Daniel to tell her it was no problem. First period was English. Mrs. Henderson had us working on essay drafts, but about halfway through class, the intercom crackled to life. Principal Morrison's voice filled the room asking me to come to the office. My stomach dropped. In my experience, getting called to the principal's office was never good news. It meant trouble. It meant consequences. I gathered my things slowly, feeling everyone's eyes on me. Daniel gave me a reassuring look, but I could see the worry there too. We both knew how this usually went. Kids like us didn't win. We survived. We endured. But we didn't win. The hallway felt longer than usual. My sneakers squeaked against the linoleum floor with each step. When I reached the office, the secretary smiled at me, which was unusual. She told me to go right in, that Principal Morrison was expecting me. I opened the door to his office and stopped. Principal Morrison was there, sitting behind his desk like always. But he wasn't alone. Daniel's mom was there, sitting in one of the chairs across from him. And my mom was there too, still wearing her grocery store uniform from the morning shift, her hair pulled back in a tired ponytail. My mom stood up when she saw me. She looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before. Pride. She was looking at me with pride. She crossed the room and hugged me tight right there in the principal's office, and whispered in my ear that she was so proud of me she could burst. Principal Morrison cleared his throat and gestured for me to sit down. He said he'd called this meeting because he wanted to talk about what happened yesterday. He said the school had a zero-tolerance policy for bullying, which is why Brandon had been suspended, but he also wanted to acknowledge what I did. He said standing up for a friend the way I did took courage. He said it was the kind of character he wished he saw more often. Then he said something that caught me completely off guard. He said the school board had a small fund for students who demonstrated exceptional character. It wasn't much, he said, but they wanted to give me and Daniel each $200 to use however we needed. New clothes, school supplies, books, whatever would help make our lives a little easier. $200. I couldn't even process that number. $200 was groceries for a month. It was new shoes that actually fit. It was not having to worry about my clothes falling apart for a while. My mom started crying. Not loud crying, but quiet tears that she tried to wipe away quickly. Daniel's mom was crying too. They thanked Principal Morrison over and over. They thanked him until he held up his hand and said the thanks should go to me and Daniel for showing everyone what real friendship looked like. We left the office together, the four of us. In the hallway, my mom pulled me aside. She told me she had to get back to work, but she wanted me to know something first. She said life was going to be hard for us for a long time. Money was always going to be tight. Things were always going to be a struggle. But watching me stand up for Daniel, seeing me choose kindness and courage even when it cost me something, that made every sacrifice she'd ever made worth it. I went back to class feeling like I was floating. The money was amazing, don't get me wrong. But what really mattered was seeing my mom look at me like that, like I was someone worth being proud of. The rest of the week passed in this strange new reality. Brandon came back from his suspension quieter than before. He didn't apologize, but he didn't bother us either. His friends still hung around him. But something had changed. They weren't as loud. They weren't as quick to join in when he started making fun of someone. Other kids started talking to me and Daniel more. We weren't invisible anymore. People wanted to sit with us at lunch. They wanted to be partners with us on group projects. It was overwhelming in a way, going from being overlooked to being seen so suddenly. But the biggest change came about 2 weeks after the cafeteria incident. Mrs. Henderson announced that our school was going to participate in a district-wide talent show. Each school could send up to 5 acts to compete. The winner would get a trophy for their school and a $1,000 prize for their act. $1,000. That number seemed impossible. That was more money than I'd ever seen in one place. I couldn't even imagine what a person could do with $1,000. Kids immediately started buzzing about what they were going to do. Brandon and his friends were planning some kind of comedy sketch. A group of girls from the popular crowd were going to do a dance routine. Some 8th grader who took piano lessons was going to play a classical piece. Everyone had something. Everyone except me and Daniel. We sat together at lunch, watching the excitement around us. Daniel was picking at his food again, but this time it wasn't because he was sad. He looked thoughtful. Finally, he turned to me and asked if I'd ever thought about performing. I almost laughed. Performing what? I didn't have any talents. I couldn't dance. I couldn't play an instrument. I'd never taken lessons in anything because lessons cost money we didn't have. I told Daniel as much. He got this look on his face then, something between excitement and nervousness. He said there was something he'd never told me before, something he'd been too embarrassed to share. He said his grandmother, before she died, used to sing in church, gospel music mostly, and she'd taught him some songs. He'd been singing in his room for years, just by himself, never letting anyone hear. But he thought maybe if I was willing, we could sing something together for the talent show. I stared at him. Daniel could sing. In all the years I'd known him, I'd never heard him sing once. I asked him if he was serious. He nodded, his face flushing red. He said he knew it was probably stupid. He knew we'd probably make fools of ourselves. But maybe it was worth trying. Something about the way he said it, the hope mixed with fear in his voice, made me want to try. I told him okay. I told him I probably couldn't sing worth a damn, but if he wanted to do it, I'd do it with him. His face lit up. He asked if I could come over to his house after school that day. He said he'd show me the song he was thinking about. He said it was called Stand By Me, and his grandmother used to sing it all the time. That afternoon, I walked to Daniel's house. It was small, smaller even than the apartment my mom and I shared. The paint was peeling on the outside and the porch steps creaked under our weight, but inside it was clean and warm. His mom was at work, so it was just the two of us. Daniel led me to his room, which was barely big enough for his twin bed and a small dresser. He pulled out an old CD player, the kind with the lid that opened on top, and put in a scratched disc. He said his grandmother had made him a recording of her singing before she died. He wanted me to hear what the song was supposed to sound like. Her voice filled the small room. It was beautiful, raw and full of emotion, the kind of singing that makes you feel something deep in your chest, even if you don't know why. She sang about standing by someone through the dark times, about not being afraid as long as you have someone beside you, about the strength that comes from not being alone. When it finished, Daniel looked at me nervously. He asked what I thought. I told him the truth. I told him it was beautiful. I told him there was no way I could sing like that. He shook his head. He said I didn't have to sing like his grandmother. He just wanted me there with him. He said we could practice, figure out our own version. He said maybe my voice would work for the lower parts while he sang the higher melody. We spent the next hour trying, and he was right. I couldn't hit the high notes, my voice cracked in weird places, and I definitely wasn't a trained singer. But when we sang together, when our voices combined on that chorus about standing by each other, something clicked. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished. But it was honest. It was real. We practiced every day after school for the next 3 weeks. Sometimes at his house, sometimes at mine. My mom would listen from the kitchen while she made dinner, and I'd catch her smiling to herself. Daniel's mom did the same thing. They never offered advice or criticism. They just listened and smiled like they knew something we didn't yet. The day of the auditions came. We had to perform in front of Mrs. Henderson and 2 other teachers, who would select the 5 acts to represent our school. The auditions were held in the gym after school. About 20 different acts showed up. Brandon and his friends, the dance group, the piano player, a girl who did magic tricks, 2 kids with guitars. Everyone. Daniel and I were scheduled to go last. We sat on the bleachers watching the other performances. Most of them were good. Some were really good. The piano player was incredible, her fingers flying across the keys like they had a mind of their own. The dance group had clearly spent months preparing. Their movements synchronized perfectly. Brandon's comedy sketch actually got some laughs. By the time they called our names, my hands were shaking so badly I had to shove them in my pockets. Daniel looked pale. We walked to the center of the gym together, our footsteps echoing in the big empty space. There was no music, no accompaniment, just us and our voices. Mrs. Henderson gave us an encouraging nod. She asked if we were ready. Daniel looked at me. I looked at him. We both took a deep breath, and then we started singing. The first few notes came out shaky. My voice wavered, but then Daniel's voice joined mine, steady and strong, and something settled inside me. We'd practiced this song so many times that my body knew what to do even though my brain was screaming with nerves. We sang about standing by each other, about facing the darkness together, about finding strength in friendship. And as we sang, I forgot about the teachers watching us. I forgot about the other kids waiting for their turn. I forgot about being poor and wearing worn-out clothes and all the things that usually made me feel small. I just sang with my friend. When we finished, the gym was quiet. I couldn't read the teachers' faces. Mrs. Henderson was writing something on her clipboard. The other 2 teachers were whispering to each other. Daniel and I stood there awkwardly, not knowing if we should leave or wait. Then Mrs. Henderson looked up. She said thank you. She said they'd announce the selected acts tomorrow morning. She said we could go. We walked out of the gym without saying anything. Outside, the afternoon sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Daniel finally spoke. He said he thought we did okay. He said at least we tried. I agreed. At least we tried. But what happened the next day changed everything in ways neither of us could have predicted. The next morning felt different. I could sense it the moment I walked through the school doors. There was this energy in the air, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. Kids were clustered in groups, whispering and glancing toward the office. Daniel met me at my locker, his face unreadable. The morning announcements started during homeroom. Principal Morrison's voice came through the speaker, talking about upcoming events, reminding us about library books that were overdue, the usual stuff. Then he said he had a special announcement about the talent show auditions. My heart started pounding. Daniel reached over and gripped the edge of his desk. Principal Morrison read off the 5 acts that had been selected: the piano player, the dance group, a 7th grade girl who did spoken word poetry, 2 8th graders with guitars who sang country music, and then he paused. He said the final act was one that the selection committee had debated about for a long time. He said it wasn't the most polished performance. It wasn't the most technically skilled, but it was the most honest, the most moving, the most real. He said the final act would be Marcus and Daniel, performing Stand By Me. The classroom erupted. Kids turned to look at me and Daniel. Some were smiling. Some looked surprised. Mrs. Henderson was beaming at us from her desk. Daniel grabbed my arm so tight it almost hurt, his eyes wide with disbelief. We'd made it. We were actually going to perform at the district talent show. The next few weeks became a blur of practice and preparation. The talent show was being held at the community center downtown, a big venue with an actual stage and real lighting and hundreds of seats. Schools from all over the district would be sending their acts. There would be judges. There would be an audience of parents and teachers and students. It was bigger than anything either of us had ever been part of. Mrs. Henderson offered to help us rehearse during lunch periods. She said she'd sung in a choir back in college and could give us some pointers. We met in her classroom, just the 3 of us, and she taught us how to project our voices, how to breathe properly, how to stand so we looked confident even when we felt terrified. She also helped us with something else. She said our performance needed to mean something. It couldn't just be us singing a song, it needed to tell our story. She asked us why we chose Stand By Me. What did it mean to us? Daniel spoke first. He said it reminded him of his grandmother, of course, but more than that, it reminded him of the cafeteria that day. It reminded him that having someone stand by you, having someone choose you even when it costs them something, that's what makes life bearable. That's what makes the hard times survivable. I told her about growing up poor, about feeling invisible, about thinking I didn't matter because I didn't have the things other kids had, and then about realizing that the most valuable thing I had wasn't something you could buy. It was friendship. It was loyalty. It was knowing someone had your back no matter what. Mrs. Henderson got tears in her eyes. She said that's what we needed to communicate when we performed. Not just the words of the song, but the truth behind them. The lived experience that gave those words weight. The night before the talent show, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my stomach churning with nerves. My mom had taken off work to come watch, which was huge because she never took time off. Every hour she didn't work was money we didn't have. But she insisted. She said she wouldn't miss this for anything. The next morning, she helped me get ready. We didn't have money for a new outfit, but she'd washed and ironed my nicest shirt until it looked almost new. She'd even borrowed a tie from our neighbor and showed me how to knot it. She stood back and looked at me, her eyes getting wet. She said I looked so grown up, so handsome, so brave. We met Daniel and his parents at the community center that afternoon. The parking lot was packed with cars. Families were streaming through the entrance, clutching programs and looking for seats. Backstage was chaos. Kids in costumes running around, parents with cameras trying to get photos, sound technicians testing microphones, volunteers with headsets coordinating everything. A woman with a clipboard found us and said we were performing fourth. She showed us where to wait, a small room with folding chairs and a table with water bottles and snacks. The 5 acts from our school were all there. The piano player was practicing scales on her hands. The dance group was stretching. The spoken word poet was reading her piece quietly to herself. The country singers were tuning their guitars. Brandon was there too. His comedy group hadn't made it, but he'd come to watch with his parents. When he saw me and Daniel, he looked away quickly, uncomfortable, like he wasn't sure how to act around us anymore. We could hear the show starting through the speakers in our room. The first act went on, then the second. Each time an act finished, there was applause, some louder than others. The wait felt endless. My palms were sweating. Daniel kept clearing his throat over and over. Then it was our turn. The volunteer with the headset told us to follow her. She led us through a dark hallway to the side of the stage. We could see the audience from there, rows and rows of people, all waiting and watching. The stage lights were blinding. The act before us, a group of kids doing an elaborate magic show, took their final bow and exited the opposite side. The MC walked to the center microphone. He said the next act was from Lincoln Elementary. He said it was two young men performing an a cappella version of Stand By Me. He said, "Please welcome Marcus and Daniel." The applause started before we even walked out. We stepped onto that stage, and the lights hit us, and suddenly I couldn't see anything except bright white. My legs felt weak. My heart was hammering so hard I thought everyone in the audience could probably hear it. Daniel and I walked to the two microphones set up center stage. The applause died down. The room got quiet. So quiet I could hear someone cough in the back row. So quiet I could hear my own breathing amplified through the sound system. We were supposed to start. We'd practiced this 100 times. We knew exactly how it went. But standing there in front of all those people, I froze. My mouth went dry. My mind went blank. I couldn't remember the first word. I couldn't remember how to breathe. Daniel looked at me. I looked at him. And in his eyes, I saw the same fear I felt. But I also saw something else. Trust. He trusted me. He believed in me. He was standing by me right now in this terrifying moment, just like I'd stood by him in that cafeteria. I took a breath, a real one, deep and full, the way Mrs. Henderson had taught us, and I started singing. My voice came out stronger than I expected. The first line about the night coming and the land being dark. Daniel's voice joined mine on the second line, harmonizing perfectly like we'd practiced. And just like that, we were doing it. We were actually doing it. We sang about not being afraid as long as we had each other, about standing together no matter what came. And as we sang, something amazing happened. I stopped being nervous. I stopped worrying about messing up or what people thought. I just sang with my best friend, telling our story through someone else's words. I could see the audience now, my eyes adjusting to the lights. People were swaying slightly. Some had their hands over their hearts. I spotted my mom in the third row, tears streaming down her face. Daniel's parents were next to her, holding hands, both crying too. We reached the final chorus. Our voices grew louder, more confident. We weren't just singing anymore, we were testifying. We were sharing something true and real and deeply personal with hundreds of strangers. And somehow that felt right. That felt important. The last note hung in the air for a moment, and then the room exploded. People were on their feet. The applause was deafening. It wasn't polite applause. It wasn't the kind of clapping you do because you're supposed to. It was the kind of applause that comes from somewhere deep, when something touches you in a way you didn't expect. Daniel and I stood there stunned. We'd hoped people would like it. We'd hoped we wouldn't embarrass ourselves. But this was beyond anything we'd imagined. We walked off stage in a daze. Backstage, the other performers were staring at us. The piano player said that was incredible. The dance group said we should have warned them we could sing like that. Even the volunteer with the clipboard had tears in her eyes. The rest of the show continued, but I barely registered it. My body was still vibrating with adrenaline. Daniel kept grabbing my shoulder and shaking his head in disbelief, unable to form words. Finally, all the acts were finished. The judges deliberated for about 20 minutes while the MC entertained the crowd with jokes and announcements. Then they called all the performers back on stage for the results. We stood in a line, all 20-something of us from different schools. The judges sat at a table in front of the stage with their scorecards. The head judge, an older woman who taught music at the high school, took the microphone. She said every act had shown tremendous talent and courage. She said choosing winners was incredibly difficult. She announced third place, a group of dancers from another school. They squealed and hugged each other and accepted their trophy. She announced second place, the piano player from our school. She walked forward gracefully and accepted her award, smiling but clearly disappointed. Then the judge paused. She said, first place this year had been unanimous. She said all three judges had been moved by one performance in particular. She said it reminded them why they loved music and art in the first place. Because at its best, it's not about technical perfection. It's about truth. It's about connection. It's about making people feel something real. She said first place went to Marcus and Daniel from Lincoln Elementary. I didn't move at first. I couldn't process what she'd said. Daniel had to pull me forward. We walked to the judges' table in a complete fog. She handed us a trophy bigger than anything I'd ever held. She handed us an envelope with the prize money. She shook our hands and said we should be very proud. The audience was applauding again. My mom was crying so hard I could hear her from the stage. Daniel's dad was standing up, clapping over his head. Mrs. Henderson was in the back row, both hands pressed to her mouth. We'd won. 2 poor kids from the back of the cafeteria had just won the district talent show. The next week at school was surreal. Our picture was in the local newspaper. The principal made an announcement about our win during assembly. Kids who'd never talked to us before were congratulating us in the hallways. Teachers were treating us differently, like we'd proven something they hadn't expected. But the best part wasn't the attention. It was what we did with the money. Daniel and I split the $1,000 evenly, $500 each. For most kids, that might not seem like much. But for us, it was life-changing. I used mine to buy my mom a new winter coat. Hers had been held together with safety pins for 2 years. I used some to buy myself actual new clothes that fit properly. I used some to stock our pantry with real food, the kind we usually couldn't afford. I even had enough left over to save some for emergencies. Daniel did similar things. He bought his dad new work boots. He bought himself the shoes he desperately needed. He bought his mom flowers, just because he could, just because she deserved something beautiful that wasn't a necessity. But the money wasn't even the most important thing we gained from all of this. What mattered more was the shift in how we saw ourselves. We weren't just poor kids anymore. We weren't just the ones getting made fun of or pitied or ignored. We were talented. We were valuable. We had something to offer the world that had nothing to do with how much money our parents made. Brandon never apologized. Not directly, but about a month after the talent show, he approached me and Daniel at lunch. He stood there awkwardly for a minute, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Then he said he'd entered a poetry contest. He said he didn't know if his poem was any good. He asked if maybe we'd be willing to listen to it and give him honest feedback. It was the closest thing to an apology we were going to get. Recognition that we weren't beneath him, that maybe we actually had insights worth hearing. We said yes. We listened to his poem, which was actually pretty good, and we told him so. We also suggested some places where he could make it stronger. He listened. He took notes. He thanked us. It wasn't friendship exactly, but it was something. It was the beginning of mutual respect. It was acknowledgement that we all had value, regardless of what we wore or where we lived or how much was in our bank accounts. Years later, after I'd graduated high school and was working my way through community college, I ran into Daniel at a coffee shop. We hadn't seen each other in a while. Life had taken us in different directions. He'd gotten a scholarship to a music program. I was studying to be a teacher. We sat and talked for hours, remembering that day in the cafeteria, the talent show, all of it. Daniel said that experience changed his entire life trajectory. He said before that he'd thought his future was set, limited, predetermined by his circumstances. But standing on that stage and realizing he had something valuable to share with the world, that opened up possibilities he'd never considered before. I told him I felt the same way, that defending him in the cafeteria wasn't just about friendship. It was about refusing to accept that our circumstances defined our worth. It was about insisting that we mattered, even when the world tried to tell us we didn't. We finished our coffee and hugged goodbye. Before he left, Daniel turned back and said something I'll never forget. He said sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand by someone who's hurting, not because it's easy, not because you'll get something out of it, but because it's right, because we all deserve to have someone in our corner. And still, there was something that needed to be said directly to you. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel and comment below which part moved you the most. And before you go, there's a recommended video right here that will give you chills. Watch it now. Have you ever judged someone and later discovered you were wrong? What lesson did you learn from this story?